Today's speaker actually needs very little introduction. He is a man on a mission who's been changing the world for the better for a lifetime already. Before we start with his mission, we will say a few words about our Frontiers mission. Frontiers is actually a very simple mission. We're here to make all of science open so that everyone can live a healthy life on a healthy planet. Now, why is sharing science openly so very important? I'd like to illustrate this with the current COVID pandemic. Over the last year, since the start of the pandemic, more than 400,000 coronavirus research articles were published. And on the mandate of the US White House, all of these research articles were made open access, even those published in subscription journals. And that was because the urgency of the pandemic made it crystal clear that we got to be sharing scientific progress on COVID very rapidly and openly. And only because that has actually happened, were scientists around the globe able to collaborate far more effectively, and they delivered. They delivered treatments and vaccines at a speed never seen before in human history. But then, of course, the pandemic is not the only global emergency that we face, and that it can only be addressed through science. The climate emergency is already affecting millions of people, and over the next decades will determine the fate of all life on this planet. And just like with COVID, science does have the solutions for the climate crisis, but it's only through open science that we will be able to deliver those solutions fast enough. And we certainly are in need of fast solutions to prevent the worst outcomes of the climate emergency. Our speaker today is former US Vice President Al Gore. Al Gore has been tirelessly raising awareness for the climate urgency over the past 45 years. He brought global warming to a global stage in his Oscar-rewarded film, An Inconvenient Truth. He's also the co-founder and chairman of the Climate Reality Project, which is focused on climate education and solutions to the climate crisis. And it is exactly about these solutions that he will be talking today, and why we can be optimistic about our future. So it is my great honor and pleasure to hand the microphone now to the leading voice in the fight for the future of our planet, Al Gore.
My talk today is called The Case for Optimism on the Climate Crisis, and I'm sure many of you are wondering how one can be optimistic about this issue, particularly with the increasingly dire impacts of this crisis, but I am. Just take a look at the way the market has shifted dramatically toward sustainability. The astonishing cost reduction curves for clean solar and wind electricity, batteries, electric vehicles, and hundreds of less well-known but truly dramatic hyper-efficiency improvements are profoundly reshaping the economics of sustainability. Renewable energy is an example. In 2014, for example, just before the Paris Agreement was reached, electricity from solar and wind was cheaper than new coal and gas plants producing electricity in only 1% of the world. 5 years later, in 2019, solar and wind were the cheapest sources of new electricity in more than 2/3 of the world. And in only 3 years, they will be cheaper in virtually 100% of the world. For 60% of the coal plants around the world, it is already cheaper to just shut them down, replace them now with new solar and wind. And the economics are driving those decisions. 54% of global emissions are coming from countries that now have net zero targets in place. And there are strong intermediary targets being set as well. Recently, more than 1,800 large companies have set science-based emissions targets, and more than 300 companies have made commitments to go 100% renewable in their energy sourcing. Microsoft plans to be carbon negative by 2030 and has announced an inspiring plan to actually erase its historic emissions by 2050. I hope that sets a trend. At long last, we have now finally reached the political tipping point on this crisis. We are beginning to cross it now, and it will shift us toward the actions that are necessary. We have arrived at this moment thanks to the incredible advances in science and technology that have mobilized millions around the world to speak up for our collective future. And indeed, the thing that gives me the most hope is what the science says about our agency to address the climate crisis. The latest synthesis report from the IPCC, which outlined the extreme consequences of our failure to address the climate crisis, also showed the incredible power we have to take the actions necessary to avert the worst of those consequences. The worst case scenario is not the only option we have to live with. We have the solutions we need in hand now. And if we deploy them quickly enough, we can avert the worst impacts. Not only that, but according to some scientists, including Michael Mann, once we reach net zero emissions, global temperatures could stop rising with a lag time of as little as 3 to 5 years. Some others say a decade or more, but it's within a short period of time. In other words, there is a switch we can flip. And if we take action now, we will be able to see the benefits in our lifetimes and in our children's lifetimes. I find an incredible amount of hope in that. It energizes me to continue fighting for progress each and every day.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mr. Vice President. Thank you very much for your really passionate and compelling arguments. I'd also like to send a word out of thanks to the almost 5,000 people that have joined us today. There's some questions that are already coming across. If you have a question, we're going to try to have Mr. Gore field a few of these towards the end of the session. But first, we're going to look at some of these ideas that Mr. Gore has presented more depth. To guide the discussion this afternoon, we have 3 experts with us. Very excited to have these 3 people who have agreed to join the panel, who will provide some additional insight into climate change from 3 very complementary perspectives. Our first contributor is Kurt Vandenberghe from the European Commission. Kurt is advisor to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, on the European Green Deal. He's coordinating one of the major political commitments to addressing climate change that Mr. Gore alluded to, the European Green Deal, which aims for the European Union to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This commitment involves drastic cuts to greenhouse gas emissions, as well as new policies and targets across a range of issues and sectors, not just clean energy, but also in terms of circular economy, environmental protection, farming, and innovation. So, Kurt, over to you for more on what Europe is doing to become the first climate neutral continent, and this by 2050.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you for inviting me to this panel, and thank you, Vice President, for your very passionate intervention and your plea for action, but also your expression of optimism. I agree with you that we have probably now reached the tipping point for climate action, and I think if the past summer has made one thing very clear and obvious, it is that climate impacts are becoming inescapable, and climate action is becoming unavoidable. There's not only the extreme weather events, you call them atmospheric tsunamis, which I think is a very, very apocalyptic term, but it says it all. But there's also been the very, very outspoken, unprecedentedly outspoken report from the IPCC over the summer. So those who don't believe the extreme weather events can turn to the reports from scientists. So I think what is clear now is that our living environment will change. The question for us is, the choice for us is, do we want that change to happen by disaster or by design? And that's the context in which we are approaching it. I think if you look at climate action, the case for climate action, which we have packaged as the European Green Deal in the European Union, is blatant from every angle you look at it. Ecologically, it doesn't need any explanation, but also economically, it's very obvious. I think we have reached the limits of a fossil fuel-based economy, and actually the rising energy prices that we currently see in markets across the world are another illustration of that. Financially, the European Central Bank has recently published a report of the climate stress tests they did of our banking system. And they clearly show that early action is much more advantageous for the financial sector than waiting with climate action because the number of non-performing loans will simply become too staggeringly high. I think you very eloquently put the finger also on the social aspect of climate action. If we don't take action, it's the socially vulnerable, the poorer households that will suffer most. And there is, of course, the moral obligation. We have to leave something for the next generations so that they can continue to live well on this planet. So for us in the European Union, fortunately, the question is no longer if we need to take climate action or how much we should do, but the real question we now have is how to take such climate action. It's quite remarkable, I think, that in the European Union, 27 countries, together with European Parliament, have agreed in a very democratic process earlier this year on the first ever EU climate law, which is basically meaning that we all bind ourselves to becoming climate neutral by 2030 and to achieve, as you said, Vice President, a reduction of CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions of at least 55% by 2030. This is no law. This is a legal obligation for the 27 member states of the European Union. And that's why we presented back in July, just 2 months ago, what we call the Fit for 55 package. It is not a fitness program for middle-aged persons like myself, but it's really a fitness package with measures to make the transition to a climate neutral economy possible and feasible. It's the first ever concrete and comprehensive plan presented by a major economy to make this happen. This plan has been impact assessed with science and evidence, so we know what the impacts will be. And what we can say from this impact assessment is that this transition to minus at least 55% will be very tough. It will be very demanding. People who think that this will be a piece of cake are very much mistaken. We already have a target of 40% in the European Union. Going for 55% is not simply adding 15% on top. We are really going for a wholesale transformation of our economy, of the way we consume, produce, live, heat our homes, move, etc. Basically, we will do in the next 10 years 2.5 times more in cutting emissions than what we have done over the past 10 years. But with this plan and the impact assessment, we're also able to show that this transition is doable. And if it is done right, it will actually be good for us in terms of economic growth and prosperity, in terms of jobs, but also for having, as you said, a healthy environment. Now, there is no single bullet to this, no silver bullet to make this happen. There is not one law that will all make this happen. We are building on existing proven instruments we have already deployed over the last 2 decades. We have shown that we can make this transition cost efficient and socially fair by using an optimum mix of policy instruments, basically combining carbon pricing, putting a price on pollution, and reinvesting the revenues from that pricing into innovation and social compensation, coupling that with regulation and binding targets on sectors and countries so that we clean the energy we use and we use energy much more efficiently than before, and having this accompanied by a big investment framework, which is illustrated by our next generation EU program, which is our post-COVID recovery program, where at least 37% of the funding will go into climate action. And maybe in concluding, what I would like to briefly do is simply list very quickly what are the key tenets of this Fit for 55 package. A first tenet is that all sectors need to contribute to make this happen. This is a whole of economy, a whole of society transformation, which is also illustrated by the fact that it is a whole of government approach. We have had literally hundreds of colleagues in the European Commission working together over 2 years from all different departments to make this kind of plan possible. Secondly, solidarity. It's an expression of climate justice. For us, solidarity is important in the European Union, not only between our member states, where the richer have to carry bigger burdens than the poorer, but also socially within our societies. And we are actually, for the first time now, thanks to this climate action, coming with new policies to help address energy poverty that exists in all our member states. It's a dividend, if you like, of the climate action. It's a new social contract that is made possible thanks to climate action. The third tenet is that all this has to be and will be growth enhancing and will be boosting innovation and investment. The biggest demanders now for climate action and ambitious climate action are the investors, the financial world, because they want clarity and predictability in the investment cycles so that they can invest. And money is not the problem. It's the projects that we need to make sure that the investment will happen and will have a return on investment. And we already see, for example, in Europe, that we are now the continent with the highest investment in terms of hydrogen and especially green hydrogen. And last point, and that will lead to my question to you, Vice President, we have to be, of course, internationally open. The EU represents only 8% of global CO2 emissions at this point in time. We have to play a role. We will do this by leading by example, showing that the transition is possible and good. We will do this by building alliances with everyone in the world. We will do this by providing climate finance. We already provide now more than 30% of all the climate finance in the world, although we only represent 8% of CO2 emissions. And we are starting to show that we will actually have a difficulty in accepting dirty products onto our markets in the future. But you said very rightly, Vice President, that the COP26 will be a moment of truth for the climate, for the global community. So my question to you is, given your long-time global experience, what should we do? What can we do to make sure that the rest of the world moves along and doesn't find excuses for delaying action? Because no one can deny climate change anymore, but many people are still out there to delay climate action. Your suggestions and recommendations would be very welcome. Thank you.
Ultimately, one of the biggest incentives for major economies to tackle this climate crisis is to avoid the long-term costs associated with its impacts. And I mentioned this in my earlier remarks, but it bears underscoring. In total, extreme weather disasters cost the global economy $2.5 trillion over the last decade, $1 trillion more than the preceding decade, and they're projected to get worse, much worse, unless we act. Obviously, we simply cannot afford the cost of inaction. But at the same time, action on the climate crisis is a win-win in terms of avoided impacts and economic growth. Economic competitiveness in the 21st century is going to be increasingly driven by our push toward sustainability and hyper-efficiency, particularly energy efficiency. Those countries that establish the most effective policies to foster the growth of clean energy industries will be the ones that will reap the greatest rewards of this historic economic opportunity. One final answer to your question. I think Mother Nature is the most persuasive advocate, and I think we're now seeing the consequences of people taking on board what's happening with 1.1 degrees and hearing the scientists with fresh ears about what could happen if we don't act. But we have to keep pushing on every front.
Thank you very much, Kurt, and thank you very much, Vice President Gore, for the exchange. We're gonna try to move very quickly on to our next panelist. So we now turn to Joeri Rogelj. who's Director of Research at the Grantham Institute at Imperial College in London. Joeri's climate change research combines an Earth system science approach with studies of societal change and policy. This includes looking at the effectiveness of international climate agreements, carbon budgets, and emission pathways to limit global warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Joeri has led major scientific reports that inform international climate policy, including the 5th and upcoming 6th IPCC assessment, and including also the annual emissions gap reports published by the United Nations Environment Programme. One of the core questions that Joeri addresses in his work involves what happens after net zero carbon targets are met. And so, Joeri, the floor is yours for more on this subject.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fred, and thank you for inviting me to participate to what is already an incredibly interesting and stimulating event. In my remarks, I want to start with following up on the long list of climate impacts that Mr. Vice President started his remarks with. It is clear that we already live on a fundamentally changed planet. If we look around us, we see wildfires, heat waves, devastating floods, life-threatening storms. It's good to remind us that this is a world that has warmed by just over 1 degree Celsius due to our activities. And I don't think that this is a safe one. So we are unprepared and we haven't even seen the worst of it yet. Fortunately, we also understand what we need to do. And the latest report by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has once more emphasized what needs to be done. Global CO2 emissions need to be reduced to net zero to stop their warming contributions from getting worse. Also, other greenhouse gases need to be kept in check. And we have heard the long list of measures that exist to achieve this. But the point that I want to make here is that we cannot stop here. Achieving net zero is only the beginning. And there are several reasons why that is the case. Mr. Vice President Gore already mentioned some of them. First of all, climate action is much slower than what is required to keep warming to the safety limits that were set out in the Paris Agreement. We have failed to reduce emissions over the past 30 years. And even today, if we combine all the pledges, all the policies, and even all the net zero targets that we heard about, this still means that there is a very high chance that warming will exceed 2 degrees, and let alone that we will keep it to 1.5. So that means that once we manage to halt warming, we will have to consider to gradually start to reverse that warming that we have already caused. And going beyond net zero and achieving net negative emissions is the only means that we have of durably achieving this. A second reason why we have to go beyond net zero is that not everyone can reach net zero emissions, or some will need more time. And this is both a question of solidarity, as my colleague Kurt Vandenberghe already mentioned in his remarks, but also a question of necessity. That means that some sectors, some countries will need to go beyond net zero into net negative territory to ensure that globally we reach net zero emissions. And then finally, the final reason why net zero is only the beginning is indeed, excuse me, how our climate responds to our emissions. Our current best estimate is that indeed global warming will stop once we reach net zero CO2 emissions. That understanding is confirmed by the 1.5 degree special report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and also by its most recent 6th assessment report. However, that same report also highlights that we can't exclude a significant amount of warming still to occur after we reach net zero. And if this is the case, this is yet again an additional reason why we will need to reach net negative emissions. In a project with Frontier in Science, actually, we are currently looking further into this to better understand the risks and prepare society to go beyond net zero when required. And so it is clear, net zero is only the beginning. And that brings me to my question to Mr. Vice President. Thinking long term and acknowledging that the future is created today, how would you see the prospect of going beyond net zero? Is this a useful vision? Is there a moral hazard that we try focus on net zero targets, net negative targets, while reductions are needed today? And how do we correctly incentivize countries and companies? Your insights and experience in this area would be really interesting. Thank you.
I agree with you. We definitely need to go beyond a net zero. We're now in excess of 417 parts per million CO2, and most of the world's leading climate scientists, virtually all, and Naomi could tell us, but most of them, including Jim Hansen, say that we need to return at least down to 350 parts per million. We were pre-industrial at 280. During the beginning of the agricultural revolution, we were at 260. And so we need to go negative. I agree with that. There are many different ways to get there. We need to do a better job of maintaining our existing carbon sinks, but we also need to create incentives for additional carbon sequestration. Regenerative agriculture, sustainable forestry, further development of direct air capture. We can't exclude the possibility of technological breakthroughs that will make capture of CO2 more affordable and realistic, but we can't rely on it. The main thing, again, is to stop making the problem worse. Stop using the air as an open sewer. But in any case, I agree with you, so I'll hush at that.
Well, thank you very, very much, Joeri, for providing this important additional context, and thank you, Mr. Gore, for again the passionate call for action in this space to really avoid the worst in terms of this transition. Our next speaker, our next contributor, will speak on how to effectively engage the public about climate change policies. I invite Naomi Oreskes, who is professor of history of science at Harvard University, also affiliated with the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard. Her research focuses on earth and environmental sciences, with a particular interest in understanding scientific consensus and dissent. She's a leading voice in the role of science in society and on the reality of anthropogenic climate change, and has published widely on these subjects, including co-authoring the best-selling book, Merchants of Doubt, which shows how, for political reasons, a small group of scientists ran effective campaigns to deny well-established scientific knowledge on issues from tobacco to climate change. So with this short introduction, Naomi, over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here today with the Vice President, the other speakers, and the 4,000 people who are online with us from around the globe. So thank you all for being here with us today. So our framework today is science-led solutions for healthy lives on a healthy planet. And what I'd like to add to this conversation is the argument that science is a necessary but not sufficient condition for change. Science, of course, has to lead in many areas because it offers the factual foundation for understanding the character, the causes, and the scale of many of the challenges we face. In dealing with the climate crisis, as in previous issues like acid rain and the ozone hole and various public health crises, including the public health crisis caused by tobacco products, we have seen repeatedly that science gives us the foundation for action. But we've also seen that that foundation by itself is not enough. So if we go back and we think about acid rain, if we didn't have the science, we might have seen that some of our forests and lakes were showing signs of damage, but we wouldn't have known that it was being caused by air pollution, particularly sulfur pollution from burning coal in coal-fired power plants. If we think about the ozone hole, if we didn't have the science, we might have noticed a whole host of distressing effects on our plants, on our livestock, and on public health. But we wouldn't have known it was because the ozone hole was being depleted, and we wouldn't have known that it was a particular group of chemicals, the chlorinated fluorocarbons, that were responsible for all of this damage. And then, of course, if we come to climate change, all of our speakers today have already noticed that climate change is all around us. You don't have to be a climate scientist to see that the world around us is changing, and also to see many of the biodiversity losses that have occurred. But it's climate science that tells us what's driving this, and that it's greenhouse gases, and that therefore our solutions must include getting greenhouse gases under control, stopping emissions, and maybe then moving to negative emissions. So in all these issues, science is an absolutely essential foundation, and it behooves all of us who are involved with science to do everything we can to communicate the science clearly, both to our fellow scientists in other fields and also to the general public. But we also know that even as scientists must act as sentinels and communicators, that alone is not enough. It's not sufficient for change. And the reason is simple, and I've been writing about this for many years. It's because we have seen in many different contexts now that people have abundant reasons to ignore, to deny, to dismiss, and to disparage science when it threatens their interests or their way of life. For decades, we have seen how the fossil fuel industry has confused people about the reality of climate change, so that many people either weren't sure about the science or weren't sure if action was really needed, or I would say today, aren't sure what actions will really make a difference. We have also seen how hundreds of millions of people around this globe continue to suffer from tobacco-caused illnesses, not because they don't know that tobacco is bad for them, but because of advertising and marketing, they became addicted as teenagers or even children, and now they can't stop. And this year, poignantly, tragically, we have seen, as the Vice President said, the scientific community stepped up to the plate in a massive way, to use an American metaphor, hit a home run, hit a grand slam, produced these astonishingly effective vaccines in a very, very short amount of time. This is a giant success for science. It's proof that our scientists are doing the work that we need them to do. And yet, we have seen how so many people, particularly here in the United States, but in other countries as well, have rejected these vaccines out of fear, out of anger, out of suspicion, or in some cases, outright political belligerency. These problems do not arise because of failures in the science. They don't arise because the science is inadequate or insufficient. And therefore, crucially, they cannot be fixed with more science. And that's a hard message for scientists because science is what we do. But we have to acknowledge that there's another crucial piece to the story. These kinds of problems can only be fixed by exposing disinformation for what it is, by helping people who are stuck to get unstuck, and by working compassionately and with emotional understanding to overcome fear and anger and suspicion and belligerence. In other words, we can't just talk about 2 degrees of warming or 1.5 degrees of warming or the various diseases that tobacco causes. The list is now over 200 different diseases, or just reassure people, don't worry, the vaccines are safe. We have to start a different kind of conversation, a conversation that addresses people's worries and concerns, even if we might not think that those concerns are scientifically valid. We need to start a conversation that speaks to people's hearts as well as to their heads. And so my question for the Vice President today is, what sorts of conversations have you witnessed or been a part of that you think do this effectively? Thank you.
Conversations that effectively combat disinformation and misinformation all start the same way, and that is with listening. It's important to understand where someone is getting their information. That's the best way to understand where their hearts and minds are. If you don't take the time to do that, you're never going to successfully meet them where they are to begin that conversation. But ultimately, I found that in communicating effectively about the climate crisis to any audience, no matter how skeptical or no matter how supportive, there are 3 budgets that I try to keep in mind. First, the time budget. Most audiences are not going to give you forever to discuss all of these issues. And all of us are here today because we're dedicated to engaging in an in-depth conversation about climate action. But most people, and especially the media, are more interested in shorter messages about climate. Second, there's a complexity budget. When discussing the connection between the climate crisis and these extreme weather events or the solutions issues like the levelized cost of energy, it can quickly get very complex in a way that can really impede understanding. And of course, it's a tough balance to strike because you also want to present the full range of issues, but try to reduce the complexity when you can and alternate between more complex concepts and easier to understand ideas so that people don't tune out. Third, and maybe most importantly, is the hope budget. I spend a lot of my time speaking with the best scientists in the world, so privileged to speak with you all today. And unfortunately, they have sometimes not had good news as it relates to the environmental impacts we're seeing. However, if you only discuss the worst case scenarios, it's easy for people to tip into a feeling of gloom and doom and despair, and that can induce a form of paralysis, because after all, despair is just another form of denial. One other point, Naomi, you know, I've spent a lot of time, in addition on the climate crisis, to what are called information ecosystems. And we saw a historic transition 500 years ago with the introduction of the printing press, and then broadcasting of radio and ultimately television in the 20th century, and now the social media and internet forms. In each of these transitions, there has been a period of turbulence immediately after the new ecosystem became established. And we're seeing that now with social media. People are seduced to go down into these rabbit holes of disinformation. And at the bottom of the rabbit hole is an echo chamber. And when they stay in that echo chamber at the bottom of the rabbit hole for long enough, then some people become, from all appearances, nearly impervious to reason and science. And it's not entirely a new phenomena, but it is new at a global scale on the kinds of issues that we're discussing here. And we have to hold accountable the companies, including the large polluters, who are responsible for financing a lot of those rabbit holes and for financing that information. Your book with Eric Conway, The Merchants of Doubt, was really a landmark in this regard. But now it's time, just as consumers have been holding businesses accountable for their emissions, they need to start holding businesses accountable for financing the emissions and for financing the disinformation. Look, this is an all hands on deck moment. This is a time for every tool in the toolkit. Everything is at stake. So we really have to pull out all the stops.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Gore. Thank you very much, Naomi, for this incredibly rich exchange. The discussion from the beginning of this presentation has really, I think, going to contribute to winning the hearts and minds of people around the importance of this subject. We're running a little bit behind schedule, but I still want to be able to take one or two questions from the field. So I'm going to invite Thomas Sherry to take the microphone and ask your question.
My question has to do with tipping points. I'm concerned about tipping points, and especially multiple simultaneous tipping points. And we're in a race against the rapid deterioration of the climate that'll make the globe uninhabitable. What's the science on that, and what's your take on that?
There are, generally speaking, about 9 tipping points. I may not be able to recall them all quickly, but first of all, the Atlantic, the global circulatory pattern of the ocean. The Gulf Stream is the most commonly is the best known feature of what's called AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current. The thawing of the permafrost in the Arctic region, where there's an enormous amount of biological matter frozen in the soils there. We've seen 7,000 of these methane bubbles in Siberia. Some have exit craters when they explode. And it's very difficult to measure because it's over such a large area, but that is another tipping point. The accelerated melting and destabilizing of the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. And now we have to add the same process in the much larger area of ice in East Antarctica. We're seeing the threat of tipping points with the South Asian monsoon and the African monsoon. Those are both tipping points. You could say that the biodiversity crisis, the sixth great extinction, is also has tipping points embedded in it. I'm missing some of the others, but there are several of them, and that in alone should be a cause for alarm. Now, fortunately, there are also some positive tipping points in our political system. I'm hoping we're at one now, as I've said. There are positive tipping points in the science and technology revolution that we call the sustainability revolution. So yes, we are in a race. We have to implement solutions at scale before we blunder across one of these negative tipping points that really puts this on a self-sustaining puts it on a basis where it continues to get worse on its own. Oh, the Amazon rainforest shifting over into a savanna from a rainforest is another similar tipping point. So you're quite right. We have to avoid them all, and that means moving quickly. I wanted to add one other thing, if I could, on the positive side. I mentioned business and politics. The investor community is moving very powerfully. There are now $43 trillion in portfolios where the managers of those portfolios in the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance have pledged to make their entire portfolios net zero. That's about half of all the assets under management worldwide. So we are seeing a dramatic shift in investment and capital and business plans. Now at COP26, we have to cross this positive tipping point in the political arena.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gore, for telling us a little bit about these important tipping points. We have one last question, I think, that we're going to take from the field. I think it's a very nice question to end the discussion for today. So, Paul Bingham, are you still with us?
I'm an academic at a UK university, and I would really appreciate your views, Vice President, on how I and other academics around the world can do more to educate about the challenges and the potential solutions that will help us decarbonize more rapidly.
Thank you for asking the question. It's one I hear a lot from people in every line of work. I think that academics and scientists have a very powerful and respected voice. Raising your voice, becoming an advocate, becoming a participant in the political dialogue, and using your authority as an academic, a researcher, and scientist to inform the discussions that are going on there. Of course, making the changes in your own life, but the most important way you can help is by using your voice and vote in the democratic process. And in the UK, where you live, of course, you're hosting COP26, and there are numerous opportunities to join with others in raising your voice to demand faster action.
And so here we are already at the end of the allotted time. So it's unfortunate we need to close this very interesting discussion. I want to thank Mr. Gore once again for his articulate and organized comments, which also at the same time were passionate and compelling. So I think it's a rare mix of qualities for this type of presentation. Thank you very much. And I also thank, on behalf of the entire Frontiers team, Kurt Vandenberghe, Joeri Rogelj, and Naomi Oreskes, and to all those who contributed today. Thank you to those who attended. On behalf of the team of Frontiers, I hope you enjoyed the session, and we look forward to seeing you soon again at the next Frontiers Forum. So goodbye, everyone. It was great to see you all again.